a 23-year-old woman was flying first class to Dallas on an American Airlines flight in early 2024 when she became combative toward cabin crew members after drinking one Jack and Coke. She seemed severely drunk, leading to the suspicion that she had started drinking alcohol before the flight and was accused of threatening and throwing her luggage at flight attendants. When the plane arrived at its destination, police were waiting on the jet bridge to arrest the inebriated passenger. A flight attendant was too scared to escort the woman off the aircraft at the officer's request, so the woman exited the plane on her own and was met by the cops, who took her aside and questioned her about the incident. She became agitated as the officers told her they were arresting her and refused to let her call the person who was supposed to pick her up. The police explained that she was being charged with a misdemeanor and would be held for 4 hours and released as long as she cooperated. Instead of following the officer's advice, the woman had a colossal meltdown upon arriving at the police station. She cried and rambled about how embarrassing the situation was, refusing to let an officer get a word in edgewise as he tried to tell her that she was making things harder for herself by behaving in a combative fashion. Left with no other choice, the cops restrained the belligerent suspect and escorted her into a cell as she continued to yell demonically. The outcome of the case is unclear. Number 20. John Bird. Law enforcement in Maricopa County, Arizona, arrested one of their own in early August of 2024 when a detective with the county attorney's office was charged with murdering his wife. 47-year-old John C. Bird's wife, Elizabeth, was found dead at the couple's home in Meza's Crimson Creek neighborhood after deputies were dispatched to the residence to perform a welfare check. The 43-year-old victim's friend had contacted the police after she fell out of contact and failed to show up for a gym class that they regularly attend together. Elizabeth's friend grew even more worried when her 3 children told her that their mother's bedroom door had been locked all day. The woman picked up the kids and took them to her house while the authorities figured out what was going on. There were reportedly no major visible injuries on Elizabeth's body, which was found on her bedroom floor. Her vehicle was gone and her husband was nowhere in sight, leading investigators to suspect that he had killed Elizabeth and gone on the run. Law enforcement pulled him over and brought him in for questioning after spotting the vehicle later that day. At the time of Elizabeth's murder, John was on medical leave from his job due to ongoing mental issues and stress, both at work and at home. He explained that he and his wife were arguing at around 6:00 a.m. when a switch just flipped. John admitted to choking Elizabeth to death, locking the bedroom door so the kids couldn't see what had happened to her and leaving the house. He acknowledged an awareness of the wrongfulness of his actions and is now facing a second-degree murder charge. In addition to being a respected member of law enforcement, John had no criminal history and volunteered in the community. Needless to say, local residents were shocked to learn of his arrest. The accused wife killer is currently being held at the Maricopa County Jail with bond set at $750,000. His case will be handled in neighboring Pima County to avoid any conflicts of interest. Number 19. Sean Petrosino. 64-year-old schoolteacher Nancy Petrosino and her 63-year-old husband, Michael, were found dead from multiple gunshot wounds inside their Orange County, Florida home in November 2014. Police discovered the slain couple after Nancy had failed to show up at her job, prompting concerned colleagues to contact law enforcement. Nancy's car was missing from the driveway, and the couple's 30-year-old adopted son, Sean, was nowhere to be seen, despite having moved in with his parents just days earlier. Neighbors told investigators that Sean had seemed depressed and had gone to a local shooting range several times in the days leading up to his parents' deaths. As a quadruple amputee who had lost his hands and legs as a teen after contracting bacterial meningitis, he initially seemed like an unlikely person of interest in the case, but he was connected to the double murder through physical evidence and was seen using his parents' ATM card after the crime, landing him at the top of the suspect list. Nearly a week after the shooting, Sean was pulled over for making an illegal U-turn in Memphis, Tennessee, while driving his mother's stolen car. He had swapped out the license plates, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the officer realized that he was a wanted fugitive. By the time the officer approached the car, the young man was dead. Sean had grown increasingly depressed in the months leading up to the murders. He had failed to establish a successful career, lost his house to foreclosure, and became separated from his wife of 4 years. Police documents later revealed that Sean was an avid gun user who had modified his weapons to accommodate his disabilities. A report described him as very functional despite his disability and noted that there was enough evidence to charge him with 2 counts of second-degree murder. In the wake of his death, authorities concluded that he had acted alone and considered it a closed case. Number 18. Hannah Upp. 23-year-old school teacher Hannah Upp left her New York City apartment for a run one day in 2008, but failed to return home, leaving behind her wallet, phone, and ID. 3 weeks later, a Staten Island ferry captain spotted her face down in New York Harbor, roughly a mile south of Manhattan. As soon as rescuers lifted Upp out of the water, she gasped and bursted into tears. She was treated for hypothermia and severe sunburn and had no recollection of how she had spent her time after disappearing weeks earlier. Surveillance cameras had captured video of her visiting several gyms, a Starbucks, and an Apple store, but it failed to paint a complete picture of her activities during that time period. After failing to detect any brain abnormalities, doctors diagnosed Upp with a rare type of amnesia called dissociative fugue, which is characterized by sudden memory loss, unexplained travel, and in extreme cases, the formation of a new identity. 5 years after the first incident, Upp suddenly disappeared again while working as a teacher in Maryland. She regained her memory 2 days later while standing in a creek. Upp tried to put the bizarre episodes behind her and moved to the US Virgin Islands, where she took another teaching job. In September of 2017, she vanished from St. Thomas during the 2-week period between Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which ravaged the islands. The young woman's clothing was found folded on a beach along with her car keys, and her car was parked nearby with her personal belongings inside, but Upp herself was nowhere to be found, and she hasn't been seen since. All 3 of Upp's disappearances occurred during the month of September in different years, and they all seemed to be connected to water. There's no way of knowing if these patterns are coincidences or if there's a deeper meaning behind them. Some people believe something went wrong during Upp's swim that morning, causing her to drown. Others suspect that she may have experienced another dissociative fugue and wandered off into danger after getting confused. Most agree that she wouldn't have survived Hurricane Maria out in the elements, and that she's most likely no longer alive. Unfortunately, the circumstances surrounding Upp's disappearance and possible death may never be known. Number 17. Dominic Michelli. In June of 2018, 46-year-old business owner Joe Pavola was ambushed by a madman with a meat cleaver and a hatchet at his gym in Belle Meade, Tennessee. By the time emergency responders arrived, his attacker had fled the scene. Pavola succumbed to his injuries on his way to the hospital. Investigators identified the victim's former employee, 36-year-old Dominic Michelli, as the prime suspect in the case. Pavoli had fired Michelli 14 months prior to the deadly encounter. A few months before the murder, Michelli had escaped from a halfway house in Washington, D.C., where he was mandated to treatment after being charged for trespassing at the White House. Police captured Michelli in Bowling Green, Kentucky, following a more than 24-hour manhunt. Thanks to a civilian tip, he was charged with first-degree murder and 4 counts of aggravated assault. More than 4 years later, in 2022, Michelli pleaded guilty to a reduced second-degree murder charge. The judge sentenced him to the 25-year maximum, with the requirement that he serve his entire term behind bars. Michelli was planning to raise an insanity defense if the case had gone to trial, and it was clear that he suffered from mental health issues. Rather than risk a not guilty verdict, Parvola's family decided that it made the most sense to agree to a plea deal. The victims' loved ones may have been willing to negotiate in court, but they were very vocal about how they believed a lot more could have been done to prevent Parvola's murder. The halfway house that Michelli absconded from was required to notify U.S. Marshals of his escape, but the staff failed to do so until weeks after the fact. During his time on the run, Michelli had made a number of threatening and bizarre Facebook posts, including one stating, "There will not be any mercy doled out after this post, but since nobody seemed to be looking for him in the first place, nobody was attempting to track his posts," which may have led to his whereabouts. Parvola's widow accused state and federal authorities of failing to heed the warnings of Michelli's family and friends, who had reportedly warned law enforcement that Michelli was dangerous and a flight risk. She believes that if investigators had tracked Michelli's bizarre Facebook posts following his escape, they could have stopped him from killing her husband, and Parvola might still be alive today. Number 16. Randall Mason. John Romano was a teenager when he went to prison for attempted murder. In 2004, he fired a shotgun inside his high school in Albany, New York, after suffering from depression for many years and reaching his boiling point. A staff member was injured while wresting the gun away from Romano, but thankfully nobody was killed. He was released early in 2020 at the age of 32 after serving 16 years of a 20-year sentence. Grateful for his second chance at freedom, Romano vowed to be part of the solution to America's gun violence problem. He became an outspoken mental health, prison reform, and social justice advocate, working with law enforcement agencies and speaking at conferences, while also working at a homeless shelter. During the summer of 2022, a 42-year-old client named Randall Mason approached Romano at the shelter and began hurling racial remarks at him. Romano's co-workers told Mason to stop, but he continued, spewing derogatory insults. So the employees told him he had to leave and allowed him to retrieve his belongings from a locker room. A few minutes later, Mason emerged from the locker room wielding 2 large swords. Without hesitation, he began hacking away at Romano, who could feel his limbs detaching from his body. He tried desperately to hold his arms and legs together but lost consciousness before emergency responders arrived. Paramedics rushed Romano to the hospital, where doctors attempted to reattach his nearly severed hands. He also suffered serious head injuries. Since the attack, he's undergone multiple surgeries to repair his hands, but he still has limited use of his limbs. In early 2023, Mason pleaded guilty to second-degree attempted murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. Romano extended compassion toward his attacker during his victim impact statement, telling Mason that he forgives him even though his life will never be the same, stating, "No matter what you did to me, I wish you well." Number 15. Christopher Thomas Knight. During the 1980s, rumors began to circulate in Maine's Kennebec Valley about a character nicknamed the North Pond Hermit. Suspicions of the hermit's existence arose when people began noticing food and other basic provisions missing from their vacation cabins. But nobody ever saw the break-ins and the thefts occurring, leading some to believe that the North Pond Hermit was a mythical figure rather than a real person. Proof of his existence finally came along in 2013 when police arrested a suspected thief named Christopher Thomas Knight, who had finally been seen stealing from someone's property, courtesy of the owner's security camera. Knight had vanished in Massachusetts 27 years earlier. In 1986, he abandoned his job, drove north until his car ran out of gas, and lived alone in the woods until his arrest nearly 3 decades later. During that time, he had only 3 very brief encounters with other humans. In one encounter, he said hi to a hiker in passing. Another time, he realized someone was home while he was burglarizing their cabin and fled the scene before they saw him. 2 months before Knight's arrest, he crossed paths with 2 fishermen who promised not to tell anyone they saw him after he explained that he just wanted to be left alone by society. Knight expressed genuine remorse for stealing from people. After serving a short jail sentence, he reunited with his brother and got a job. As part of his punishment, the judge ordered him to undergo mental health treatment. He no longer lives in the wilderness, but he continues to live a quiet lifestyle in a rural area, largely removed from mainstream society. Number 14. Sally McNeil. Professional bodybuilders and U.S. Marine veterans Sally and Ray McNeil married just months after meeting in the late 1980s. Sally and her 2 children from a previous relationship would later claim that Ray became physically and mentally abusive within days of tying the knot. Ray put all his time into pumping iron and preparing for competitions, leaving Sally as the household's main breadwinner. In addition to paying all the family's expenses, she financed Ray's costly steroid use, which she would later blame for his violent behavior. The deteriorating marriage hit its breaking point on Valentine's Day in 1995, when Sally fatally shot Ray at their Oceanside, California home. By then, Sally had discovered that Ray was having an affair and had started making plans to leave him as soon as she could afford to. She shot her husband as he arrived home from a date with another woman, leading to speculation that the murder was motivated by jealousy and anger. Sally claimed that she suffered from battered woman syndrome and had acted in self-defense when Ray choked her in a fit of roid rage. In 1996, she was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. She was paroled in 2020 at the age of 60 after serving 25 years. Sally maintains that she shot Ray in self-defense but has focused on rebuilding her life and enjoying her freedom, which include a full-time job and a new marriage. Number 13. Jeremy Alex. 28-year-old Jeremy Theodore Ted Alex and his girlfriend Susie were in the process of moving into a rental home in Northport, Maine in April of 2004 when he suddenly began acting strange. He seemed eager to get away from Susie and insisted on moving some things to their rental house without her. Alex's drug use had recently spiraled out of control, and it had become a problem in the relationship, leading Susie to suspect that he wanted to party without her, getting on his case about it. While moving things into the rental house by himself that night, Alex became convinced that he saw Susie and 2 of her friends standing outside in ski masks and staring at him. He was in the throes of a multi-day cocaine bender and was still highly paranoid when he confronted Susie the next morning. Alex was convinced that bad guys were out to get him and accused his girlfriend of being in cahoots with these imaginary entities. The couple argued, Alex left, and Susie never saw him again. A short while later, Alex was seen running through a local resident's yard. He approached the homeowners with money in his hand and begged them for help, but fled when they called the police. The next day, his van was found abandoned in a parking lot with his keys and cell phone inside. Alex's trail went cold there, and his whereabouts remain a mystery to this day. Police believe his drug use may have triggered his paranoid delusions. The case went cold until 4 years later, when a couple turned Alex's wallet over to law enforcement. They claimed that they had found it washed up on a local beach shortly after he vanished, but had only recently realized that it belonged to a missing person. Unfortunately, the wallet failed to provide any leads on Alex's whereabouts. He's still considered missing, but as the years pass, his loved ones have come to accept that he's probably never coming home. Number 12. Renee Molina. Police in Bakersfield, California, found 24-year-old Joseph Paul Danny Lotza Jr. dead in the street while responding to a reported shooting one night in December of 2022. He had been shot, and investigators quickly identified his girlfriend of 8 years, Renee Molina, as the suspected culprit. Earlier that night, Molina had been celebrating her birthday with Lotza and others at a nearby house party where she drank too much alcohol and got sick. Her friends put her to bed, but she woke up a little while later and angrily confronted Lotza with her suspicions that he had cheated on her with one of her friends. The couple fought violently, leaving the home's interior damaged and bloodstained. Lotsa was talking on the phone with a friend a little while later when he mentioned that someone had grabbed his gun. The friend on the other end could also hear him saying, "You're not going to shoot me, are you, babe?" followed by a popping sound. Molina was reportedly too drunk to speak with law enforcement, but she was coherent enough to acknowledge that she was responsible for her boyfriend's death. Meanwhile, the friend that she had accused Lotsa of cheating on her with admitted that Molina's suspicions were correct. During a court hearing in early 2024, Molina tearfully claimed that she was blackout drunk and had no recollection of shooting Lotsa. She was originally charged with first-degree murder, but pleaded no contest to a reduced voluntary manslaughter charge and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Number 11. Anton Piper. Canadian anti-poverty activist Anton Piper vanished in 2012 after being last seen in Toronto. At the time, his family harbored growing concerns about his mental state. About a year earlier, Piper had been arrested on assault and weapon charges following an altercation. He was awaiting trial when he disappeared. Piper's family searched for him for 5 heart-wrenching years without finding even a trace of evidence of where he might be. Answers finally came in 2016 when he was seen walking barefoot along a roadside in the Brazilian state of Rondônia, more than 6,500 miles from where he had gone missing. He caught the eye of Brazilian-Canadian police officer Helenise Vidigal, who noticed that he looked disheveled and out of place. Piper had no ID in his possession, but he told Vidigal that he was Canadian. She did some digging online and was able to connect with his family, who were both shocked and thrilled to learn that he had been found. In the meantime, Piper was taken to a hospital. He managed to escape, sparking renewed fears that he would fall back into obscurity and put the search effort back at square one. Thankfully, he was found and taken back to the hospital, where he remained until his brother arrived to escort him back to Canada several weeks later. Piper later said that he spent much of his time missing on foot, walking thousands of miles while somehow passing through 10 countries without proper identification. He lived off nature and the generosity of strangers as he traveled toward Argentina in hopes of fulfilling the goal that inspired his 5-year trip to visit the National Library of Buenos Aires. When Piper finally reached his destination, he was turned away for not having proper ID. He trekked another 880 miles into the Amazon wilderness before the encounter with the police that led to him being identified. Piper's brother, Stefan, admitted that the timing of Anton's disappearance makes it seem as though he was running from the law. But Stefan believes that Anton's actions were propelled by his mental illness, especially given his willingness to return to Canada and face his outstanding charges. He was released on bail after arriving in Toronto, and while the outcome of his case is unclear, his family vocalized their intentions to continue providing him with the support he needed in order to get his life back on track. Number 10. Richard Sotka. 58-year-old Rhonda Cegelski and her best friend, 53-year-old Paula O'Connor, were found stabbed to death inside a Green Bay, Wisconsin apartment in February of 2023. The disturbing discovery was made by Cegelski's daughter, who found her mother's body in the kitchen. O'Connor's body was near the front door, and the 8-inch knife that the culprit had killed the women with was still lodged in her neck. Both victims had been stabbed multiple times in the face and neck, making it clear that the murderer had killed them in a fit of rage. Police quickly identified Cegelski's boyfriend, 48-year-old Richard Wendell Sotka, as the suspected killer. At the time of the double slaying, he was out on bond and wearing an ankle monitor while facing stalking, harassment, and restraining order violation charges in an unrelated case. After killing the victims, Sotka cut his ankle monitor off and skipped town. Police found the discarded device in a ditch. Thankfully, his equipment was equipped with an OnStar GPS tracking system. Authorities caught up with him in Arkansas roughly 10 hours after the bodies of Cegelski and O'Connor were found. He was traveling with his passport and $4,000 in cash, but he claimed that he just wanted to take one last drive before he inevitably lost his freedom. Sotka admitted to killing the women in an alcohol and stimulant-fueled rage, claiming that he had walked in on them being intimate with each other. He said he felt humiliated and that he snapped when one of the victims told him to leave the residence. During police questioning, Sotka revealed that he had been sentenced to prison 21 years earlier for attacking a woman he was dating at the time. He fractured the victim's skull, broke her leg, and knocked several of her teeth out. Sotka was extradited to Wisconsin, where he faced 2 first-degree murder charges and several other counts, including criminal damage to property, 3 counts of felony bail jumping, and 2 counts of misdemeanor bail jumping. His defense attorney urged the jury to convict him of the lesser charge of first-degree intentional homicide. The prosecution argued that Sotka had acted with intent, using photos of the victim's injuries to support their claim. In March of 2024, the jury found Sotka guilty of 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and 6 other charges, landing him behind bars on an automatic sentence of life without parole. Number 9. Amber Gerwick. 33-year-old mother of 4, Amber Gerwick's family reported her missing in Blackman Township, Michigan, in April of 2011 after she was a no-call, no-show at her job for 2 days. The next day, her abandoned minivan was found hundreds of miles from her home outside a Dollar General store in Tunnel Hill, Georgia. Gerwick's wallet, keys, and other items that a person normally carries with them were inside the vehicle. Her parents, who lived nearby, told investigators that they were not expecting a visit from their daughter. After deserting her van, Gerwick somehow traveled 650 miles to Joliet, Illinois, where she flagged down a police officer 3 weeks after she went missing. She told the cop that she didn't know who or where she was, and that the last thing she remembered doing was leaving an ice cream shop in Michigan because they didn't have the flavor she wanted. It took 2 days, but police were eventually able to identify Gerwick. She had no recollection of driving from Michigan to Georgia or from Georgia to Illinois, and she remembered very little of what happened during the time period from when she went missing to when she was found. Doctors concluded that Gerwick had suffered from a condition called dissociative fugue, and that she most likely entered her confused state as a delayed reaction to the traumatic divorce she had gone through several years earlier. Amber's memory has mostly recovered. Unfortunately, some of the memories of the time period encompassing her disappearance were highly traumatic, requiring her to undergo therapy in order to work past some of the things that had happened to her. Number 8. Matthew Palut. While responding to a Plymouth, Massachusetts home early one morning in August of 2024, officers arrived to find 73-year-old Anthony Palut suffering a fatal stab wound to the neck with a bloody kitchen knife nearby. The elderly gentleman's adult son, 26-year-old Matthew Palut, quickly became a person of interest in the crime. Matthew had fled the scene and was apprehended 3 hours later during a traffic stop in Hanover, roughly 20 miles from the murder scene. Police noticed that there was blood on his clothing, and he was booked into custody on suspicion of murder. Neighbor Lisa Caola told CBS News that Anthony and his wife were wonderful parents who did everything for their son. While the circumstances leading up to the murder remain unclear, records show that Matthew has been accused of violence in the past. In 2020, he allegedly threatened a woman at gunpoint at a bank, and local residents told the media that they had seen police responding to the Palut's home on multiple prior occasions. One neighbor claimed that they had once overheard Matthew threatening to kill Anthony. Matthew's brother supported these claims of past aggression, telling investigators that Matthew frequently yelled at his parents and once said that he couldn't wait for Anthony to die. Moreover, Matthew was reportedly on probation for a previous conviction at the time of his arrest for killing his father. His mother told law enforcement that her son's behavior took a turn for worse after he began smoking marijuana. During the accused killer's arraignment, the prosecution revealed that he had admitted to snapping on the day of Anthony's death. Matthew also disclosed that he had mental issues but refused to speak any further. He remains held without bail as he awaits his next court date, which is scheduled for October. Number 7. Hiroro Onoda. During World War II, Hiroro Onoda served as an intelligence officer for the Japanese Imperial Army. He was stationed at a remote jungle post on Lubang Islands in the Philippines, where he was instructed by his superiors to stay and fight at all costs. After Japan surrendered in September 1945, Onoda was among hundreds of the country's soldiers across China, Southeast Asia, and the Western Pacific who refused to surrender and instead went into hiding. In an effort to coax them back into society, leaflets were dropped from airplanes informing them that the war was over and Japan had lost. Believing the leaflets were enemy propaganda, Onoda remained stationed in the wilderness. He was initially joined by 3 other soldiers, and the group violently attacked anyone who tried to come near them. Unaware that he was still alive, his family back in Japan had him officially declared dead in 1959. One of Onoda's companions surrendered in 1950, and the other 2 were shot dead, leaving him as the sole survivor from 1972 moving forward. 2 years later, in 1974, the lone warrior's family learned that he was still alive. His brother and former commanding officer traveled to Lubang to try coaxing him out of the woods, and finally, after more than 30 years after the war's end, he emerged from the jungle wearing his Imperial Army uniform, cap and sword. Onoda formally surrendered by ceremoniously handing his sword to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who gave the sword back and pardoned the man for killing as many as 30 people he had mistook for enemy soldiers. The 52-year-old was greeted with a warm welcome when he arrived in Japan, where he received a medical checkup and landed a book deal. He was in remarkably good physical shape, but he struggled to mentally adjust to the fast-paced modern society that he returned home to. Longing for peace and quiet, Onoda spent a decade farming in Brazil before moving back to Japan, where he created nature camps for children. He passed away in 2014 at the age of 91. Number 6. Felina Hopkins. In January of 2023, 52-year-old romance novelist Felina Hopkins abruptly left her home in Seattle and drove to Wyoming without explanation. With no indicator of where she had gone, someone close to the woman reported her missing. During her mysterious getaway, Hopkins got her vehicle stuck along a snowmobile trail in Yellowstone National Park and was assisted by law enforcement, who sighted her and sent her along her way. About an hour later, police in Jackson, Wyoming, spotted the author's car idling in the middle of the road and attempted to pull her over. She led rangers on a 24-mile chase into Grand Teton National Park, where the pursuit was eventually called off for safety reasons. Police eventually disabled the vehicle using spike strips and booked Hopkins into custody on 7 federal charges, including stopping or parking on the roadway, speeding, and fleeing or attempting to elude. She was released from jail 3 days later and failed to appear at her next 2 scheduled court hearings. Investigators discovered that after being released from jail, Hopkins went to a Verizon store where she bought a new cell phone and changed her number. From there, Hopkins went to the Jackson airport. Her whereabouts remained a mystery for nearly 3 weeks before law enforcement discovered the new phone and tracked it to the Hawaiian island of Kauai. In December of 2023, Hopkins pleaded no contest to eluding a police officer, unsafe operation of a motor vehicle, and having a vehicle where only over-snow vehicles are permitted. The remaining charges were dropped, and she was placed on unsupervised probation until she paid $2,340 in fines and restitution. During the hearing, Hopkins claimed she fled from law enforcement because a park ranger had caused her to fear for her safety, and she was a woman alone in a blizzard. The judge concluded that she did not have a reasonable basis for eluding, and her reasons for driving to Wyoming in the first place remain unclear to this day. Number 5. Eric Nicholas Gapco. In July of 2024, footage of a man throwing a tantrum on an American Airlines flight from Seattle to Dallas went viral. Later identified as 26-year-old Eric Nicholas Gapco of Delanco, New Jersey. He reportedly ate 10 marijuana edibles prior to his outburst, which included propositioning and assaulting a flight attendant, singing at the top of his lungs, vaping, refusing to sit down, and harassing fellow passengers. In the video, cabin crew members could be seen forcibly removing Gapco from the bathroom. The flight was diverted to Salt Lake City, Utah, due to his disruptive behavior. Gapco was arrested upon landing at the airport, where passengers helped flight attendants restrain him and escort him off the plane. He reportedly broke a glass door while being taken into custody and admitted to consuming a high amount of THC after initially denying taking drugs. Gapco is facing federal charges of interference with a flight crew and attempted damage to an aircraft. He's currently awaiting his next court date at the Salt Lake County Jail with bond set at $2,000. Number 4. Danielle Morris. Travelers on a packed Greyhound bus in Arizona were jolted awake late one night in 2014 when a passenger went on a meth-fueled rampage and attacked the driver. 25-year-old Danielle Morris rushed to the front of the bus, pounced on the driver, and assumed control of the wheel as he threatened to flip the vehicle, nearly causing a collision with oncoming traffic. Several passengers tried to pull the crazed man off the driver as the bus struck a median outside Phoenix at 70 miles per hour. 24 passengers were hospitalized with injuries after being thrown from their seats, including 7 people who suffered broken bones. Thankfully, Morris's efforts to flip the bus were unsuccessful and everyone survived the crash. The driver was credited with preventing a worse outcome by keeping his hands on the wheel and doing everything in his power to maintain control of the bus during the attack. Morris and his girlfriend fled into the desert on foot but returned to the scene a short while later and were taken into custody. A police spokesperson said that Morris was hallucinating at the time of the attack. He believed that a fellow bus passenger was trying to kill him and remained irrationally paranoid throughout his arrest. Morris ultimately was found incompetent to stand trial. Number 3. Michael Samdas. In May of 2023, a frantic driver approached a young jogger named Taylor in Tampa and warned her to run while pointing behind her. A large man was charging at Taylor and she was unable to get away. She screamed for help at the top of her lungs as the man attacked her in broad daylight, laughing as he punched her repeatedly and threw her to the ground. A bystander pointed his gun at the attacker and ordered him to stop, but he ignored the command and struck the witness on the head, knocking him onto the sidewalk. The onlooker's son intervened and the assailant fled the scene. Taylor suffered a concussion, a broken nose, and bruising to her face. Police quickly apprehended the suspect, who provided the name Ezja Beelzebub Nodopa, while being taken into custody on an aggravated battery charge. In a shocking twist, he was later identified as 44-year-old Michael Samdas, who had disappeared in Canada nearly 4 years earlier. Samdas vanished from his mother's home in Hamilton, Ontario in September 2019, and his family had been searching for him ever since, until a few years before his disappearance. He lived a normal life as a successful real estate agent. His personality changed seemingly out of nowhere when he began talking to himself and isolating, and no longer caring about his appearance. Concerned loved ones tried getting mental help for Samdas after he became prone to violent outbursts, but he was resistant to treatment. For several years, efforts to find him turned up empty-handed. He was even featured on the Paramount Plus series Never Seen Again, but his whereabouts remained a mystery until his arrest in Florida, when a missing persons organization identified him in his mugshot using facial recognition software. After Samdas was found, his mother and sister flew to Florida to attend one of his court hearings, and they expressed sympathy for the victim of his attack. Unfortunately, he did not seem to recognize his family members, and he did not respond to his given name, but he answered to the name he had given to police during his arrest. Samdas was deemed incompetent to stand trial and involuntarily committed to a state hospital. The state could resume their prosecution of the case in the future if he's deemed competent to proceed. Today's topic was requested by Who Day All Day, Yelena McCain, and Nikki123BXD. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Noel Marie Dah. Late one night in December of 2016, a 28-year-old Michigan woman named Noel Marie Dah called 911 and said that she was stranded in the city of Birmingham. She had driven her Jeep off the road and gotten it stuck on some railroad tracks, but she was actually in Ferndale, and police didn't figure out her real location until they received a report that the vehicle had been struck by a train. Thankfully, Dah was not in her Jeep when it was hit. Officers arrived to find her standing outside the SUV while still on the phone with dispatch. Dah reportedly blew a .19 during a breathalyzer, which is twice the legal limit for driving in Michigan. She was arrested on a super drunk, operating while intoxicated charge, but the outcome of the case is unclear. If you thought flipping out couldn't get any crazier, wait till you see how brainlessness can lead to tragedy. After number 1, we've got our previous release of when having a low IQ goes wrong lined up for you, so stay tuned. Number 1. Baby hater has a mid-meal meltdown. A 50-year-old Mississippi woman was eating at a Mexican restaurant called the Jalapeno Grill in June of 2024 when she became irate and began yelling about a noisy baby. Footage captured by the child's mother, Maddie, showed the angry diner shouting about how the people sitting near her couldn't hear her talking over the child's crying. Several customers came to Maddie's defense and condemned the rude woman for her behavior, but her explosive behavior continued, and police were called to the scene. Once officers arrived, everyone at the restaurant was advised to get their food to go unless they wanted to be arrested. The unhinged woman could be seen calling Maddie a derogatory word and giving her the middle finger before being escorted out of the restaurant by the police. Maddie shared a video on TikTok clarifying that her child was not crying throughout the entire restaurant visit and that she would have left on her own accord if that had been the case. She explained that she was at the restaurant with her mother and her son, and that her son had cried when her mother took a pen away from him. The vast majority of commenters rallied around her and condemned the irrationally angry customer, whose mugshot was featured in the post. 31-year-old Ladian Logan from the Queensborough of New York City was arrested for crashing into a parked vehicle in Uniondale, a Nassau County hamlet. The accident occurred in the spring of 2017, and when police arrived at the scene, Logan became belligerent. The woman, who'd been driving drunk with her 6-year-old son in the car, started screaming and cursing at the officers. She was handcuffed after a brief struggle and led to the back of a police cruiser. Neither Logan nor her son was hurt in the crash. The woman was taken to jail while the boy was placed in the care of family members. True to her inebriated state at the time, Logan was wearing a Support Your Local Bartender tank top in her booking photo. She was charged with drunk driving, resisting arrest, and endangering the welfare of a child. Number 10. Matthew Davey. Just before 5 p.m. on October the 31st of 2016, British man Matthew Davey walked into a Santander bank in Cheadle in the Greater Manchester area. He passed the female teller a note claiming he had a gun and asking her to fill a bag with all the money from every counter. In the CCTV recorded raid, Davey wore gloves and a pair of multicolored Hawaiian shorts, but nothing to cover his face. The teller pressed the alarm and the shutter went down, forcing 35-year-old Davey to leave the bank empty-handed. A few days later, on November the 2nd, Davey went to an RBS bank also in Cheadle wearing the same shorts. He called a teller working behind the counter, but the worker was wary, having heard about the recent Santander incident. A prosecutor would later state that Davey mumbled something about having a bad day as he tried to put a charity box in his backpack. He was arrested later in the day. A judge considered that Davey's culpability was significantly reduced due to his poor mental health, which had been exacerbated by substance abuse. He was given a 2-year sentence, suspended for 2 years. Number 9. Claire Margaret Meum. On the afternoon of October the 27th of 2022, the authorities in Mesa, Arizona received calls about a possible drunk driver. The police arrested 23-year-old CLA Margaret Meum and charged her with driving under the influence. As she was taken into custody, the woman told officers that she might have left her baby at home without any supervision. Law enforcement followed up on the report, and upon reaching Meum's residence in East Mesa, they were reportedly able to hear her 5-year-old's cries from outside the home. Footage from the woman's doorbell camera indicated that she'd left the property at 12:44 p.m., which meant that she'd abandoned the child for over 2 hours until she was found by the police. The severely intoxicated woman claimed that she had no recollection of the events that followed after she'd left her baby in the crib. Records indicated that Meum, who lived alone, had made no efforts to find someone to babysit prior to going out and drinking during the day. Fortunately, the child was unharmed and was subsequently placed in the care of a relative. In addition to the DUI charge, Meum was also charged with child abuse. Yet, in spite of her disturbing actions, she was seen displaying a wide smile in her mugshot. Number 8. Nagathran K Dharmalingam. In April of 2009, Malaysian man Nagathran K Dharmalingam was caught entering Singapore with a bundle of heroin strapped to his thigh. Following the discovery of the package, which reportedly contained approximately 1.5 ounces, 21-year-old Nagathran was sentenced to death by hanging, in line with the country's zero-tolerance policy on drug possession beyond a certain quantity. The young man gave several statements regarding his crime. In one of them, he said that he needed money for his father's heart surgery and to pay off his debts. In another, Nagathran maintained that he'd smuggled the drugs under duress as a Chinese man whom he called King had assaulted him and threatened to kill his girlfriend. Nagathran later stated that he didn't know what was inside the package. His execution was put on hold due to a countrywide moratorium on capital punishment. Nagathran was assessed by an expert and determined to have an IQ of 69, a level recognized as indicating intellectual disability. His case attracted international attention from various activists and human rights organizations who asked the Singaporean government to commute his sentence to life imprisonment. The argument was that Nagathran lacked the intellectual capacity to understand the full weight of the consequences his actions would have. The international criticism was also aimed at the country's policy of executing prisoners for drug offenses, a policy which the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights described as incompatible with international human rights law. In spite of the multitude of pleas and appeals, the Singaporean government determined that Nagathran had known what he was doing and found no merit in arguments stating differently. Roughly 13 years after his arrest on April the 27th of 2022, Nagathran was hanged at Shanghai prison. Number 7. Richard Ford. British man Richard Ford was serving a 30-month sentence at HMP Nottingham for knife possession in early 2016. In January, he passed a series of notes to his prison officers, threatening to kill several members of prison staff, a fellow inmate, a district judge, a police officer, and a former partner. He threatened to abuse their corpses and added crude drawings depicting his intentions. The following December, a judge at Lincoln Crown Court considered that the 39-year-old was highly dangerous and gave him a 45-year sentence. Ford's defense appealed the decision, offering several arguments, including the man's extraordinarily low IQ, as well as him having mixed motives for issuing the threats. Ford had spent most of the past 14 years in prison, and his defense argued that he'd become institutionalized and had committed various crimes in order to remain in jail. In one incident, after he'd been released, the man had called the emergency services claiming he was a danger to others. Ford won his appeal in 2018 as Sir Brian Leveson deemed that his original sentence was disproportionate for a man who never actually assaulted or attempted to assault anyone. Ford's actions would nevertheless still result in considerable jail time. His sentence was reduced to 12 years with parole eligibility in 8, and with an added 8 years on license. Number 6. Marvin Lee Wilson. Texas man Marvin Lee Wilson was put on death row on May the 9th of 1994. In November of 1992, he and another man, Andrew Lewis, kidnapped 21-year-old police informant Jerry Williams, Wilson had discovered that the latter was talking to the cops, which had led to them seizing 24 grams of cocaine from his apartment. Williams was found naked on the side of the road, severely beaten and fatally shot in the head and neck. Lewis was given a life sentence, while Wilson, who was determined to have been the gunman, was sentenced to death. The Supreme Court ruled in 2002 that the execution of the mentally impaired was outlawed, but left it to states to determine what constituted mental impairment. Experts measured Wilson's IQ at 61, meaning he was legally ineligible for execution. He unsuccessfully appealed his sentence on that basis. Edward Marshall, a Texas Assistant Attorney General, claimed that Wilson had displayed a functional degree of personal independence and that he was evidently able to manage money as demonstrated by his drug-dealing, street gambler criminal lifestyle since an early age. Moreover, Marshall argued that Wilson had demonstrated being capable of manipulation and inventiveness, drive, and leadership in orchestrating Williams's murder. 54-year-old Wilson's execution was carried out on August the 7th of 2012. He was pronounced dead at the state prison in Huntsville 14 minutes after his lethal injection had been administered. Number 5. Buford James Penley. North Carolina man Buford James Penley was charged with first-degree murder following the 2017 death of Joshua Christopher Stebbins in Asheville. The body of 46-year-old Stebbins was found on June the 29th behind a gas station. He was severely bludgeoned, having suffered fatal blunt force trauma to the head and body. Penley was arrested the following day. As the legal proceedings into the matter progressed, multiple psychologists, including one working for the DA's office, found the man incapable to proceed and beyond restoration. One expert reported Penley's IQ to be 65, well below the average limit of 100. The medical consensus was that Penley suffered cognitive dysfunction, including apathy, lack of insight, paucity of thoughts, communication deficits, and impaired memory. The murder charges were dropped on May the 13th of 2020 without prejudice to refile, meaning that Penley may be charged again should he regain the ability to proceed. In the aftermath, he was taken to Brofton State Hospital in Morganton for inpatient commitment. Number 4. Anthony Natali. In the summer of 2022, Australian man Anthony Natali was given a minimum of 10 years and 3 months in Melbourne's County Court for taking part in a massive drug smuggling operation. Natali, a pizza chef at La Porchetta restaurant in Melbourne, had helped in the distribution of over 660 pounds of cocaine which had been smuggled to Australia from Papua New Guinea via a Cessna plane. The shipment was reported to have contained other drugs, including MDMA and methamphetamine. In the aftermath of its arrival, multiple law enforcement departments teamed up to crack down on the syndicate. They monitored their movements and operations through wiretaps, physical surveillance, and intercepting phone communication. Natali, who was in his late 20s, was observed transporting large shipments and laundering a total of over $2 million. In October of 2018, he handed $200,000 to an undercover agent posing as a money launderer. Roughly 5 months later, he repeated the process with another officer, giving him $385,000. Law enforcement also learned that Natali had moved close to $1.5 million between Keysborough and Ascot Vale in early 2019. He was ultimately arrested at his Ascot Vale home in July of 2020. Before handing out the sentence, the judge accepted that the man simply did the bidding of the crime syndicate and acknowledged that he wasn't a mastermind. The judge was quoted as blaming low intelligence and immaturity for Natali's actions. Number 3. Zachary Morgan. In 2017, the Vanderburgh County Sheriff's Office in Indiana investigated threats made against a law enforcement officer, accompanied by threats to blow up Central High School. The troubling messages had been posted directly through the We Tip hotline, and investigators linked the user's email to 18-year-old Zachary Morgan. At the time, he had an active harassment case which had been opened the previous month. Morgan was tracked down by officers and agreed to speak to them without an attorney present. He reportedly confessed to having been behind the school bombing threats. He was arrested and preliminarily charged with intimidation and false reporting. Morgan's mother told the court during a probable cause hearing that he had a very low IQ and didn't understand the ramifications of his actions. After hearing her arguments, Vanderburgh County Circuit Court Senior Judge Carl Helt agreed to release the teen on his own recognizance. One of the conditions was that he was banned from going to Central High School. Number 2. Brandy Chilton. Law enforcement in Pine Knoll Shores, North Carolina was called to a hotel in the summer of 2020, whereupon they encountered 40-year-old Brandy Chilton. The intoxicated woman had been asked to return to her room multiple times, but refused to do so and was causing a disturbance. She remained combative throughout her interaction with the authorities and reportedly screamed profanities at them. After being taken to Carteret Health Center to be medically cleared, the woman was processed at the local jail. She was inebriated to such an extent that an officer had to hold her up for her mugshot to be taken. The end result was the woman looking disheveled and barely able to keep her eyes open while displaying a wide grin. Number 1. Sarah Wilson. In July of 2014, officers in Fayetteville, Arkansas, responded to a call at an address in the 2700 block of North Arroyo Road. The caller, 21-year-old Sarah Wilson, reported that she needed medical attention because she'd been in a fight with her 2 roommates, a man and a woman. Wilson told responding law enforcement that the former had gotten on top of her and began hitting her in the face. The police observed that Wilson had a swollen eye and bruises to her forehead. The woman admitted to having picked up a whiskey bottle but claimed that she didn't remember striking the man with it. However, further interviews with the female roommate revealed that Wilson, who'd been living with her for 6 months, had not only started the fight but had struck the man with the whiskey bottle, inflicting a large cut on his head. The roommates reportedly asked Wilson to leave, and she subsequently called the police from a neighbor's house, a course of action that backfired since she was the one who ended up being arrested. Wilson was taken to Washington County Detention Center and faced the charge of 3rd-degree domestic battery. Thanks for watching. Would you rather spend a year in complete isolation or in an insane asylum? Let us know in the comments section below.